Well, good morning, everyone. Isn't it great to have, I don't know, I just get a warm feeling whenever I hear that Texas A&M is working with Texas Tech University, is working with Oklahoma State and Tarleton State. So we're really happy to have a great team to work with us on this project this year. So my name is Mike Merchant. I serve as Extension Urban Entomologist at the Dallas Research and Extension Center here at Texas A&M AgriLife. And my job today is to give you a little bit of biology background to this project and to talk, just to give us a good idea of how plants and flowers work together. We're going to orient you to be a more effective observer as a citizen scientist for this project. And part of my job today is to make sure that you know exactly what we're asking you to look for out in the field. And I guess with that, I'll go ahead and get started, make sure everything's working here. Great. So flowers have been around for a long time, but not forever. We know from the fossil record that flowering plants first appeared about 120 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. And those of you who are knowledgeable about these sorts of things will recognize that was way back when the dinosaurs first appeared on the earth. So flowers have come in after green plants in general, but today the flowering plants make up about 85% of all species of green plants. We also know today that the amazing diversity of flowers is due in large part to insects. And insects show up in the fossil record a long time before plants do, but only when plants came along did insect diversity just explode. And so that gives us a clue right away that plants and flowers might be connected in some way. Moths and butterflies also show up in the fossil record about the same time as flowers, and probably wouldn't exist at all if it weren't for the presence of flowers. So considering how important plants are to people and to agriculture, actually plants were domesticated before animals were. It's remarkable that it's taken us so long to understand what flowers are really for, and namely that they are the sex organs of plants. And it wasn't until 1682 that a scientist named Nehemiah Grew actually discovered the role of flowers in sexual reproduction. And this idea of sexuality in plants was one that had been bandied around for a while, but it wasn't until Grew came along and resurrected the idea and showed kind of logically why it was possible and probable. So why flowers? Why do flowers even exist? Today, almost everyone knows that flowers attract insects to be pollinated. But even 200 years ago, this wasn't generally understood. Before the 19th century, the best popular explanation for the color and beauty of flowers was that they were a gift from the Creator, meant to please humans. But it wasn't until 1787 that German botanist Christian Conrad Sprengel observed while he was studying this particular flower, the wood cranesbill, that most nectar-containing flowers are arranged in such a way that insects can easily reach the nectar source, while the rain is prevented from doing so. And after a lot of observations, Sprengel concluded that the nectar of the flowers is secreted for the sake of insects and is protected from rain in order that they may get it pure and unspoiled. In 1841, Charles Darwin became aware of Sprengel's work and decided to do some research on cross-fertilization, trying to figure out why that was such an important thing. He wrote a book called The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization on the Vegetable Kingdom that showed why it was important for plants to get pollen from other plants. And basically what he showed and proved was that the offspring of cross-fertilized plants, individuals that were fertilized by another different plant, were more vigorous as well as more numerous than those that were produced by a self-fertilized plant. So we believe today that the pleasing designs and colors of plants are really for more than pleasing humans. these characteristics of flowers would help pollinators, attract pollinators, most of which are insects. So let's look at the anatomy of a flower for a minute. This particular drawing shows both male and female flower parts. We have the anthers here, which produce pollen, which are the male sex cells in the plant. And then we have the female organ right here, the stigma, that has tissue that's receptive to pollen, and pollen lands on the stigma and produces a filament that goes down and fertilizes the ovules in the ovary. So in the process of picking up, actually plant pollination occurs when an insect, and it can be wind, but insect usually picks up some of the male pollen and transfers it inadvertently to the female stigma. And in the process of picking up the treat, the insect is usually attracted to the nectar of the plant, and it accidentally just transfers that pollen. So there's a lot of agents of pollination. We know wind is very important for a lot of plants, especially things like the pine trees and the grasses and such. But there are a lot of insects that are also responsible for pollination. And of all the animals that pollinate plants, there's one group that stands out from all the rest, and that's the bees. And we're going to be spending more than usual time today talking about the bee part of this pollination equation. So we know now that most of the quarter million or so species of flowering plants are pollinated by insects. And worldwide, about 80% of crops, and in the US, about 66% of crops are insect pollinated. So that's real important. And you may hear the statistic periodically that about 1 in every 3 bites of food that we take today, we can give thanks to honeybees for, and that's comes from this statistic. And one of the neat things about pollination is that it allows for plant diversity. So if you've got a wind-pollinated plant, and think in your brain the images of ancient forests of gymnosperms of pine trees, you know, they could be pollinated by the wind. And that's fine for plants that are real common and close together with one another. But if you want to be spread apart, if plants are exploring new habitats to colonize, you need some other way to get cross-pollination. Otherwise, a plant seed that gets transported to a new spot and doesn't have any others of its same species nearby can't get pollinated or cross-pollinated anyway. So insects make this cross-pollination of even rare plants possible, and thereby increasing the potential for diversity of plants. We know that plants go to great lengths to attract insects. They provide nectar that really has no other function other than to feed insects. Pollen, which is high in protein. A lot of insects covet pollen. Lipid secretions and food bodies, sometimes on pieces of the flowers, parts of the flowers. The scents of flowers are largely present to attract insects. Resins and something called the nectar guides. The flowers themselves basically are nectar guides and attract insects. This is a picture, the picture on the lower right here. It shows a flower under normal white light as we would see it. And the picture on the upper right shows a flower under ultraviolet light. And you realize that there is patterns that we don't even see with our eyes. Now, bees and insects have the ability to see ultraviolet spectrum a little better than we can. So they actually see some of these markings. And we believe that these colors that are present in ultraviolet are guides to the pollinators to make sure that they know exactly where to go to get nectar. And this is pretty amazing. Even in regular light, normal light spectrum that we can see, you can see these color guides on flowers. So when you see these rays and speckles and dots and central colors of flowers, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a billboard, basically, to attract insects. So there's different groups of insects that do pollinate. Flies are one of them. Flies are usually attracted to flowers for nectar. There's syrphid flies, like you see here in the lower right here on your screen, that feed on pollen. Other flies feed on nectar. The flies that specifically are the flowers that are specifically designed to feed flies tend to be a little less showy than other insect attracting flowers. They tend to have stronger smell, and sometimes the smell's not so great. It's kind of a malodorous smell. The fly pollination is not nearly as well studied as bee pollination. Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, also pollinate flowers. Almost all butterflies will have this long proboscis that's designed apparently to feed specifically on nectar. And most adult butterflies and moths are primarily nectar feeding. Butterflies like tubular, especially sweet smelling flowers. And flowers that are attracting moths for pollination are generally nighttime opening flowers, and they generally tend to be white, so they contrast a little better at night for the moth that's searching for their host. Here's a butterfly feeding on a flower, and you'll notice some flowers have long lips, and those lips are there as a landing pads, not just for butterflies and moths, but also for bees and other things. And so the flower designs themselves seem to be there to perfectly attract these nectar feeding insects. The big order of insects that we're going to spend the most time on today are the Hymenoptera. This includes the bees, wasps, and ants. Now, ant pollination is fairly rare. It does occur, but it's not very common. Bees are by far the most important group in the Hymenoptera for pollination. There's about 20,000 species of bees worldwide. They all are attracted to flowers. And flowers that rely on bees for pollination tend to be bright and often have nectar guides to help direct the bees into the source of the nectar. The specific family or group of families of Hymenoptera that are especially good at pollinating plants are called the Apoidea, or bees. There's about 4,000 species of bees in North America. That's a lot of different kinds of bees. They all feed on nectar and pollen. Most of the species that are pollinators are solitary, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And the bodies of these bees are covered with very fine brushy hairs that are very good at attracting and trapping pollen. Let's do a little bee anatomy here for a minute. The first thing that you notice about this bee is, again, the hairy body, which is common to this superfamily. You'll notice the mouth parts here on this bee are lapping type mouth parts designed for feeding down in nectaries, as you would guess. They have a filamentous antenna with usually with an elbow or a bend in it right there. You'll notice that they have two pairs of wings. Now the wings often are attached together or hooked together, but they are two wings, and you'll see that second wing just bumping out a little when their wings are folded over the body. Again, hairs on the legs and the lower part of the body, sometimes used for catching pollen. And on some bees, not this particular one, they will have an expanded area on the tibia of the hind leg for holding pollen. We'll talk about that more. And again, the hairs, this just shows a little better picture of the hairs on a bee's body. Notice they're branched here like this. And that branching is designed to make the hair sticky for pollen. And that's kind of a unique bee characteristic. Now, comparing bees versus wasps, the bees just tend to have thicker bodies, as you see up here in this bee. All of these are wasps. The bees have lots of hairs, and you may see a lot of pollen sticking to bees. You tend not to see that with wasps. The wasps tend to have longer, thinner legs, often with spines on them, like you see in this picture. And some wasps will have their wings folded in half. I think this next picture shows that a little better. This is a paper wasp. Notice the crease here in the wings, right there. So that's a fold, and this wing has been folded in half longitudinally. If you see that on a Hymenoptera, you'll know right away that it's one of our vespid wasps, or vespoideate wasp. So that's a good clue that you're dealing with a wasp and not a bee. And here's just another example of that mason wasp here with a folded wing in half. Okay, I mentioned earlier that some bees have an expanded tibia on the hind leg, and this is a honeybee, European honeybee, and it's got that expanded tibia that it's using as a pollen receptacle. And as the bee encounters lots of pollen, gets it on its hairs, it will scrape those hairs off the body and push them back to this pollen basket. So the pollen basket, that little ball of pollen, it's a mixture of pollen and nectar that's been placed back in the hind legs, is a giveaway that this is some kind of bee, and it's going to mean that it's either going to be a honeybee or some type of bumblebee when you see that pollen ball on the hind leg. Sometimes certain parts of the body will be especially sticky for pollen, and there's one family of bees called the megachilid family that you can pretty much identify the family by the fact that the pollen will stick primarily on the underside of the body, like you see here. So that's kind of neat. And is this a bee or a wasp? Well, it is a Hymenoptera. It's got the elbowed antenna like we find on Hymenoptera. But notice it's got this petiole. It's more slender. It's got a slender petiole or extension between the thorax and abdomen. And notice the long, skinny legs with spines. This is a wasp. And the other group of insects that can be mistaken for bees are flies. Now, the big difference between a fly and a bee, there are different orders. A fly has 2 wings, just one pair. Bees will have 4 wings. So you'll see that clearly on this picture over here. The bee eyes tend to be oval and on the sides of the head. You see on this carpenter bee. And flies, the eyes tend to cover a greater percentage of the head, sometimes the whole head, and will sometimes almost meet at the top of the head. Also, notice the bees have the elbowed antenna that you see here, and flies have these short, stubby antenna with a little wisp of a hair attached to it in many cases, and that will distinguish a fly and a bee pretty readily. Can you count the wings on these 2 pictures? How many wings are we dealing with here? Well, turns out we have 4 wings on both these pictures. That little extra bump here, and this is hard to see on the wing. It's hard to see on the fly when you're looking at something that's moving on a plant. But just develop that eye that you're going to need to start seeing this. Once you start seeing it in the field, and it'll become a lot easier to see it subsequently. Those oval-shaped eyes here, these are 2 species of carpenter bee, one of the smallest species and one of the largest next to each other. Notice the oval-shaped eyes on both of these. They're on the side of the head, so they don't cover a great percentage of the head. And that's typical of bees versus flies. Notice this fly, 2 things. It's got shorter antennae, and it's got the big, huge eyes that encompass almost the entire head. Doesn't have big masses of pollen, but you can see it's still capable of carrying pollen on some of the hairs on its body. Another picture of a fly. Again, notice the large percentage of the head surface area that's covered by the eyes. They face forward as well as to the side and to the back. Now, this one doesn't meet at the top of the head, but they're still larger than a bee typically. And then these short, stubby antennae with the whiskers on the side called an arista. We call those aristate antennae. And again, that's something, when you see that on one of your visitors to flowers, it'll tell you it's a fly. And again, we're just repeating things here, but all of these are flies. Notice the big eyes. This one, the eyes are almost globular. Notice the antennae are short, aristate, whisker-like here on this long-legged fly. Now this is, of course, the fly that's most likely to trip you up because it looks color-wise, it looks a lot like a bee. So don't be fooled by just yellow and black coloration. That could easily be a fly or a bee, but you look for the other characters. Which one of these is a bee? I want each of you to answer that in your own mind. um, so the one on the left obviously is the bee. And again, notice the eye shape, oval shape, and the elbowed antennae here versus the stubby antenna, the aristate antenna, and the large eyes on the fly. Now, both of them do have hairs, but that's not the primary character that's going to distinguish these two groups. Now, let's talk about some bee behavior. This is a picture of one genus of bees called Diadasia, and it's a ground nesting bee. And Diadasia is typical of a lot of our solitary bees. Now, when we say solitary, that means that there's one female that makes the nest. So here's our female here, and she's created this underground warren of little nestlets underground. And this is typical of what solitary bees do. They'll build a nest with little cells in it, and within the cell, they'll place a small ball of pollen. And that's probably pollen mixed with some nectar, so it sticks together. And then she will lay a single egg on that pollen ball. Now, in this case, in this picture, the egg is hatched, and you've got a small grub feeding on that pollen ball. That's going to be repeated over and over again until she fills up an entire nest. Now, this bee did not work together to make this nest. However, she may live in the same spot with a bunch of other females. So you might find a piece of ground that's got all these holes in it, but each of the holes is tended by a single bee. And that's a difference than being social. That's not a true sociality. So, only the social bees tend to sting and defend their nest. So these ground nesting bees are totally harmless. A lot of people will be afraid of them because they see that they're bees and they're nesting underground. But solitary bees are harmless. They're each building their own nest separately. Another solitary bee is the carpenter bee, although these again can nest in groups as well. Carpenter bee is doing the exact same thing as our Diadasia just did, except for it is burrowing, making its burrow in wood. But it does the same thing. She's digging a channel, a gallery, and she will put a pollen ball at the end of the gallery and lay an egg on it. Then she will seal that cell off and go and build another cell and another cell and another cell until she fills up that gallery. And this is a picture I took off of a tree in my backyard one day, and I realized the carpenter bee had made a hole in the wood. Now, normally we see these on structures and not on native trees, but they do it on trees. In this case, I think she made the mistake of building her nest in a quick-growing, healthy tree. And 2 months later, that hole had been healed over and closed. I don't know if you can see that or not, but the hole has healed over and sealed itself. So this is another type of bee we need to be able to identify. It's the carpenter bee. Carpenter bees have a shiny abdomen, and that's going to distinguish it from other bees, including the bumblebees especially. These are large bees. They do that burrowing in wood that we just saw. And I want you to get a kind of a search image in your brain for recognizing carpenter bees. The shiny rear end here, can't see it so much on this one, but that's always going to be what's going to tell you whether you've got a carpenter bee or not. Even though they may look very much like a bumblebee. Now, carpenter bees can be pests. They will dig those galleries in any soft exposed wood. They tend to like unpainted wood, but occasionally they'll get into painted wood as well. You don't actually see the galleries in this picture. They're up above in the soffit of this house, but you can see the droppings that have dropped down. And if that's your home, you're not going to be too excited about having the bees drilling holes in the sides of your house. So they can be a pest in structures. This is another type of carpenter bee, Xylocopa micans. It's doing something kind of sneaky here, and this is something you might observe in your own garden throughout the summer. Now, flowers want bees to come in the front door, so they design these landing pads for the bee and this nice tube for the bees to go in, or for butterflies to stick their proboscis down. This bee is coming in the back door, and as such, it's bypassing the pollination process on this flower. You can see this micans has its jaws into the nectary of the flower, and it's lapping up nectar from the inside of the plant and bypassing the anthers and pistils and stamens. So occasionally bees cheat, just like people. And this is another interesting bee you may see in your garden, the leafcutter bee. Leafcutter bees do exactly what their name implies. They cut holes in leaves, and usually perfectly circular holes, a little smaller than a dime, but pretty good sized holes. And she will carry those cut pieces of leaf to a nest. It could be a naturally existing nest in a piece of wood, or one that we provide. And it will wrap those leaves together into a package in which she puts pollen and lays an egg. And so again, this process is just a little different form, but the same process as diadasia, where they're creating little nestlets for their offspring. And again, this is a solitary bee. Each female does this by herself for her offspring. Another family of bees, group of bees, are called mason bees. And this is a very pretty species, osmia. A lot of people like to attract these. These are really excellent pollinators, by the way. And greenhouse producers will sometimes rear these inside their greenhouse to get plants pollinated. Outdoors, they're one of our larger small native pollinators. You'll notice this picture came in from a homeowner. These small holes in the brick wall of the house, these were all occupied by mason bees. Now, I don't think the bees actually drilled those holes. I think they were pre-existing, but the homeowner started noticing them when the bees were going in and out of the holes, and that's when we got the call. They're not especially good diggers in rock or anything, but they will take advantage of loose mortar in chimneys and soil to dig their nests in. And they will also nest in twigs. Some gardeners today are going to the trouble of building their own bee houses, places to attract solitary bees. And I always get puzzled looks from my neighbors when they say, "What kind of birdhouse is that?" And I say, "It's not a birdhouse; it's a bee house." And they kind of wonder why I would want to attract bees that would sting me into my yard. Well, these aren't stinging bees, as we've already mentioned. These are just solitary bees. And they use galleries, natural galleries. They might use the hollowed out pith of plant stems, or any existing gallery that they can find to build their nest in. And you can encourage bees to be in your yard by building these or buying these bee boxes. Fairly simple construction. They're holes drilled in pieces of wood that allow the bees to go in. You can see these holes have been occupied by bees. They've sealed off the holes with mud. So these are occupied homes. This one is the one in my yard, and I use a combination of drilled holes and bamboo twigs in mine. And there's all kinds of things you can do. People get creative with building these. They don't have to be fancy at all. It can be a piece of PVC pipe that you stuff with straws and hang from a tree in your backyard, and that's all it takes. You do tend to want to have some shade over the holes so that it doesn't rain directly in the holes. But other than that, there's no special secret to getting this done. The screen, by the way, on this one is an attempt to keep out birds. And this is not going to be a very effective bird preventer. Birds will come along to these holes if they discover that there's bees inside, and they might peck into the holes and take some of your bees. But if that screen had been a little further out, it might have protected the bees. Let's talk a little about social bees. We talked about solitary bees so far. Some bees are social. They build a nest communally and work together, and they will defend that nest. And bumblebees are examples of one type of social bee. These bees, by the way, are doing something we call buzz pollinating, and that's when they get on the flower, they will buzz real hard and fast, and that shakes loose the pollen, and it also helps pollinate the flower. Honeybees are not very good at this, so they tend not to be very good pollinators of tomatoes and vegetable gardens. Let's talk about the honeybee for a minute, because it's probably one of the best known social bees. So one of the things you're going to have to do in this project is identify honeybees. You need to be able to do that by the time you get going here. They're a medium-sized bee, fairly slow flying for bees. The legs tend to hang below them as they fly, so you might be able to develop kind of an eye to see that. They tend to be light orange to black as a base color, and will have dark brown bands on the rear abdomen. So some of these will be lighter, some will be darker. The honeybee, the European honeybee, is not a native bee. I think that's worth noting for anybody working with bees. These are wild they're feral domesticated animals, or they might be domesticated depending on where your bees in your backyard are coming from. If they come from a beekeeper's hive, they're domestic bees. If they didn't come from a beekeeper's hive, then they're a feral bee. They're an escapee from civilization. When white settlers came to Texas the first time, or Oklahoma, there were no European honeybees. They came along with white settlers. If all the honeybees went away tomorrow, there wouldn't have any impact or effect on native plants getting pollinated, at least as far as I know, because for many millions of years, our plants here in Texas have grown without European honeybees, and they co-evolved with native bees. So native bees are perfectly capable of pollination duties here. How do you recognize the European honeybee? Again, there's that golden brown color, base color with dark brown bands on the rear end. It's a medium-sized bee. It's going to have these thick legs, and on many of them, you're going to see pollen balls as the bees are going out. Now, sometimes if the bees just come back from the nest, going out for the first time, you might not see any pollen, or you might see just a little tiny ball. It takes a while to get this big on a bee, so you may or may not see a pollen ball on the hind leg of a honeybee. Now, in Texas and Oklahoma, we have something known as Africanized honeybee. This came into Texas in 1990. It's been around for a while, and these Africanized bees, or sometimes people have called them killer bees, have been here now for 30-some years, and have interbred and hybridized with our European honeybees. So what does that mean? That means basically what you need to know is that any wild honeybees that you encounter in the landscape in Texas or Oklahoma are very likely to be at least partially Africanized, and therefore be more aggressive than the familiar European, docile, familiar human European, out in the wild in the backyard with a lot of respect, because they can be very dangerous if disturbed. By the way, there's no way to tell these two species apart, these two types of bees apart. You can't tell by looking at them what they are. We just assume that everything that we encounter here is going to be at least partially Africanized. This is a bee colony. Bees make their hives out of wax, and most of the time they like to build them in hollow cavities in trees or in other artificial nesting sites, but usually not out in the open like this one. This is an exception, but you can see at least the free form of a European honeybee nest when it is on a tree. You can see the bees in there. So this is the wax comb, all filled with honey or pollen or baby bees. Over on the right here, you see a bee swarm, and a bee swarm occurs when a female splits off from the original colony and takes a bunch of the bees with her. And this is basically homeless bees looking for a place to shelter and find a place to build a new nest like you see on the left. Um, these swarms are usually harmless. They are not, do not tend to be aggressive unless they're getting hungry. They've been away and been out of a nest for too long, but generally they're not very aggressive. They will usually move on within a day or two or three when they come in and land on a tree in your backyard like this. So it brings up the question, what should you do about those? You can either leave them alone, let them go on, or you can exterminate them. And why would you exterminate them? Well, the main reason would be that if you are concerned that they might perhaps nest in your house. Because that, if you've got a swarm in a backyard next to your home, one of the places they're going to look to see for a suitable place to hunker down is in the walls of your house. And this is why you do not want honeybees to nest in the walls of your home. They will build that same nest, but inside the wall of the house. If you have bees in your house, not only do you have to either remove the bees or kill the bees, but you also have to remove the hive. And that can be a very expensive process, hundreds of dollars to pay someone to come in and remove the hive from your house. If you don't remove the hive, you end up with a dead hive in the wall, dead bees. You get honey that will eventually start dripping out of that nest, and moths and ants and cockroaches and mice and other things that are going to come in and feed on that, not to mention the smell that would come from that decaying nest in the wall. So it's not good to have bees nest in your house. It's a very expensive deal. And you don't want bees nesting close to your activities either, because they can sting and they can attack. Bumblebees are another social bee, and they build nests that are quite different from the honeybee. They build little capsules of wax in which they store honey and pollen, and in which their offspring live. And and so this is going to be, generally you're going to find a bumblebee hive or nest within a old abandoned rodent burrow or any other kind of cavity underground. They'll sometimes be in loosely piled leaves, so they might be in a nest like that. Very interesting bees and very valuable bees. Some are excellent pollinators. The bumblebees are going to be a little larger bees, and they're going to be covered with hair and usually have bands of different colors. And you can identify the different species based on the patterns of the bands. Usually yellow and black, sometimes golden or orange colors in the bands. Like honeybees, bumblebees carry pollen mixed with the nectar on their hind leg in a structure that we call a corbicula. And so if you see a pollen ball on the hind legs of your bee, it's either going to be a bumblebee or a honeybee. You should be able to tell the difference between those two pretty easily. So this brings me, with that kind of summary of the descriptions of bees and wasps and other pollinators, brings me to kind of the point of why we're doing all of this. Pollinators need our help. We have problems right now with a lot of our species of native bees being in decline, including bees, moths, and butterflies. About 60% of species, we think, and it's not been well studied, but we think maybe up to 60% of pollinating insect species might be declining right now. And that's actually true for a lot of insects, not just pollinators. The reasons for this are many and varied. Destruction of habitat is probably the number one. I mean, all you have to do is look around and see all the new houses going up, and every one of those represents an area of native prairie that used to exist and is now going under the plow, under the bulldozer. And that's not good for bees. Parasites and pathogens are an issue, especially with our honeybees. They've been very important in some of the decline of managed honeybee nests. Changing climate is affecting bees, we think, especially bumblebees, which seem to be very slow to adapt to climate change. And overuse of and misuse of pesticides can be an issue in some areas. We're going to be encouraging the pollinators people to help pollinators by basically, first of all, teaching people more about bees and pollinators, helping them to appreciate them, not to fear them, to use pollinator-friendly plants in our landscapes, give bees nesting spots like we talked about with the bee hotels. Avoiding the use of broad spectrum insecticides, especially when they're applied over large areas of the yard. I get questions all the time. What's a general purpose insecticide I can spray on my lawn or in my garden to keep the bugs away? And that's not what we recommend. You only use a pesticide when you've got a specific purpose for it and in a spot treatment method approach. We want to spread the word and just promote efforts to protect and pollinators in general. Now, you will be given a project identification guide. Airfon will make that available through the pollination project site. It looks the one we have this year is going to look a little different than this, but it will have a QR code down at the bottom of it that will allow you to access your data forms that we'll be using for the citizen science project. This also goes over all of the things that we've talked about here as far as identifying bees and wasps, and it gives you the codes for these different insects. And I want to emphasize, you do not need to be a bee expert to participate in this study. We've talked about some basic identification skills that you're going to need to develop, but the things that we're asking you to do are not too technical. They're pretty easy. And these are the categories that you're going to have to learn for this project. First one is the honeybee, and you see a picture of a honeybee here. Hopefully you're starting to develop an eye for that. You also will need to be able to identify what a bumblebee is. And then luckily, that's all you really need to know, because all the other bees get clumped into a general category, just the other bees. So honeybee, bumblebee, and other bees will be all that you need to participate in this study. Now, you do need to also be able to identify a wasp, a fly, and a lepidoptera, a moth and butterfly, and a beetle. And again, we have pictures of all of these on our identification guide. And I do want to go over this one more time, because this is not just a lecture, but it's also a learning, teaching session. So remember how you identify honeybees. What catches your eye in that left-hand picture? Well, you should see the elbowed antennae, and especially the coloration and size and the pollen balls on the hind leg. You know it's not a bumblebee because it's not very robust body, and it doesn't have the dark black and yellow stripes, but it is a honeybee. Honeybee on the right also has some pollen. It doesn't have a pollen balls, but it has little structures called pollinia. You might see these on some of your honeybees or other bees. Pollinia are pollen-containing structures that are produced by certain plants like orchids and milkweeds. So you might see that on some of your bees. Again, these are the bumblebees. You will have to identify bumblebees. Notice all the hair on the bodies. None of these have pollen balls on their hind legs, but the hair, especially the hair that occurs on the top of the back of the abdomen. So that would identify these as bumblebees. And then you will have to distinguish carpenter bees. We don't have an actual category for carpenter bees, but if you see a carpenter bee, you need to recognize it's not a bumblebee, and you're going to put it in the other bee category. And again, look at the shiny top on the back of the abdomen here. This is going to clue you in it's not a bumblebee. This one's a little harder to see, but this one shows you. Can be a little tricky identifying these as not bumblebees, but as other bees. A variety of other native bees, and this is where the fun part comes in, because you're going to start to see, if you're looking closely at flowers and at the visitors to flowers, you're going to start to see some insects you may not have noticed before. A lot of these native bees are small bees. They're going to be really tiny. They may be covered with pollen. If you see something caked with pollen like this, you know immediately it's a bee. It's not a wasp or a fly. And again, some of them are quite tiny. Some are really pretty colors, especially metallic greens, some metallic blues. And just to review again, differences between flies and bees. Again, the eyes, and you can see on this fly how those eyes just cover the head, and it's got short, stubby antennae. It's definitely a fly, even though it's very hairy. So 2 wings also. So hairy on the thorax. Usually bees are going to be more hairy than flies, but you can see there are exceptions. Often pollen colored, especially on the hind legs and under the abdomen. Pollen dustings on flies are usually lighter, no accumulations on the hind leg. The hind legs will have really wide segments on bees. On flies, they tend to be slender, and longer elbowed antennae in bees, usually stubby antenna on flies. And again, you can see all of those things on the syrphid fly: stubby antenna, big eyes, slender legs, one pair of wings. And sometimes it'll be a little tricky, and you need to look at the insects coming to flowers closely. This is a robber fly. It looks a lot like a bumblebee just because of its large size, but look at the antenna, look at the big eyes. Now, it does have wide legs, which is a little unusual for a fly, but it doesn't have all the other characteristics. So this is actually a fly, which is a fly that's eating a honeybee, by the way, in this picture. Again, long, slender legs, big eyes, aristate antenna on both of these. Wasps and bees are other things that can be confused with bees. Remember, the wasps are going to have fewer body hairs. They're going to be more slender, and the abdomen sometimes on a stalk. The legs are going to be thinner, sometimes spiny. They're not going to be broad or hairy with balls of pollen. The wings of bees generally fold flat over the abdomen. Wings are usually V-shaped, held in a V-shaped manner on a wasp. Not always, but. And if you see that folded wing, like on this paper wasp here, that's going to indicate a wasp. This is a mason wasp or potter wasp, and some of these wasps are pretty cool in their own right. These are solitary also. They make individual pots that they fill with pollen and lay an egg in there. So any of the mud type nests that you see on the outside structure of a house or on a tree or anything like that, these are going to be mud dauber type nests made by wasps or possibly potter wasps. And they come in all sizes and designs. So some of these are pretty neat. Again, from a safety perspective, you don't need to worry about these types of wasps. They are solitary and they will not sting. They will not defend their nest. And then I think everybody can recognize the butterflies and moths, which we're keying as Lepidoptera. Okay, so what we're asking you to do is to commit to a summer's worth, or at least the better part of the summer's worth of collecting data off of some plants in your garden. And we ask you to pick up to 5. We don't want you to be overly burdened or overcommit. So up to 5 types of plants in your garden. It doesn't have to be 5. If you can only find 3 or 4, that's fine. But up to 5 types of plants that you're going to pick and designate a patch. The patch should be 2 by 2 feet. So you need to have about a 2 by 2 foot flower bundle in order to do an observation on. If it's not exactly 2 by 2 feet, that's fine. If you don't quite have that big of a spot, that's all right, but try to get it approximately that size. We don't want, patch shouldn't be 1 plant or, smaller than, 1.5 by 1.5. It should be about 2 by 2. Doesn't have to have bees. This is the thing, a lot of people worry, well, I'm not seeing bees on the plants. That's okay. We want to know which plants don't have bees as well as which plants do. So if you think you got a dud with your plant because you're not seeing a whole lot, that's fine. We want that data. It's very valuable to us. Now, one thing that I do want to mention, some of you are native plant enthusiasts and you may take pride in finding plants that nobody else in your whole community has because they're hard to find. That's not the kind of plants we want. We want plants that are on the market that people can find, because we want our recommendations to be practical for people. So we tend to want to focus on commonly available plants. You can switch the patches during the summer. If you find that your flower patch has bloomed out and there's just nothing there anymore, no flowers or anything, by all means, switch over to another plant. We would like to have some continuity on your observations. So stick with the patch for a while. Don't keep switching every time, every week. The other thing that you'll be asked to do, which Irfan will explain, there's a question on our survey about percent in bloom. And we're trying to get an idea from this what percentage of the plants actually in flower at any given time. And we just have, it's a 4-point scale. 0 is less than 25% in bloom, 1 is 25 to 50, 2 is 51 to 75, and 3 is above 76 and above. So just pretty simple classification scheme there. And we just ask for a guesstimate. It doesn't have to be super accurate. We just want to get a ballpark is how many flowers are on these plants. Are they in peak bloom or not? And to go, now this is going to be a 2-step process, and Irfan will explain a little more in a minute.